They never get it when you're there. That's the hardest truth to swallow when you're dealing with someone avoidant. While you're showing up with consistency, patience, and real effort, they're building emotional walls. Not always maliciously. Sometimes it's subtle. Pulling away after a good weekend, shutting down during a vulnerable conversation, acting indifferent when you're emotionally invested. They're running from something, and in most cases, it's not even you. It's what you represent. Intimacy, vulnerability, expectations. These things scare the avoidant, so they retreat. And in doing so, they miss what's right in front of them. It's only when you're no longer there that things begin to stir in them. See, the avoidant often thrives in the comfort of distance. They feel safe when love isn't pressing too close, so they misread your presence as pressure. They translate your care as control. Your emotional availability gets twisted into neediness in their mind because they haven't yet matured into the kind of emotional depth that a healthy relationship demands. But the moment you step back, not out of a game, not to manipulate, but because you genuinely reach your limit, they start to feel something they're unfamiliar with. Absence. And not just physical absence, emotional absence. The absence of being deeply understood, of being cared for without having to earn it. That absence is disorienting to them. They may have thought they could easily move on, that they could replace your energy with someone who asks less of them, someone who doesn't challenge them emotionally, someone who's easier. But easy doesn't mean fulfilling. And surface-level connections only work for a short time before reality catches up. Eventually, the distractions fade, the excitement wears off, and they find themselves replaying moments they didn't appreciate when they had the chance. Your voice, your loyalty, the way you held space for them. It begins to haunt them, not because you were perfect, but because you were real, and real is rare. But their realization doesn't come in a dramatic epiphany like the movies. It creeps in, quietly, in between text threads that don't stimulate them, in awkward silences with people who don't get them, in the middle of the night when there's no one left to impress. That's when they start to see it, that you weren't just another option, you were the connection they told themselves they didn't need. And that narrative begins to crumble, because while they were pushing you away to protect themselves, they were also sabotaging the very thing they were craving at their core, closeness without fear. The avoidant thinks that detachment is freedom, but what they find is that freedom without connection becomes loneliness. They remember how you showed up for them when it wasn't convenient, how you tried to understand them even when their behavior made it hard to love them. They think about the emotional safety you provided, and suddenly the things they once took for granted become the things they miss the most. That's the twist. They don't realize your value when you're giving. They realize it when they're no longer receiving. And let's be honest, your absence is powerful, because when someone loses access to your time, your energy, your emotional support, they have no choice but to sit with the void. They can't fill it with surface-level conversations or half-hearted dating, because what they lost wasn't superficial. It was emotional intimacy. You weren't just someone to talk to. You were someone who saw them, who read between the lines, who noticed what others didn't. That kind of connection isn't something people find twice, and the avoidant knows that, eventually. By the time they realize this, they're often caught in a place of emotional conflict. They want to reach out, but pride and fear hold them back. They scroll through your photos, revisit old texts, wonder if you've moved on, try to convince themselves you weren't that special just to ease the discomfort, but it doesn't work. Because deep down, they know the truth. You were irreplaceable. Not because you were flawless, but because you were honest. You gave them something they weren't prepared for but desperately needed, unfiltered, consistent love. And they start to see the cost of their avoidance, that in trying to protect themselves from the potential pain of closeness, they created a much deeper pain, regret. They didn't just lose someone, they lost a version of themselves that only existed in your presence. The softer side, the vulnerable side, the version that dared to hope for something lasting. And now that you're gone, they feel the weight of what they pushed away. It's not just missing you. It's mourning the connection they didn't know how to handle when it was in front of them. They may try to convince themselves they can move forward, that someone else will give them what you gave. But over time, they learn something very few admit out loud. Some connections can't be duplicated, because some people don't just fit into your life. they shift it. And while they might find companionship again, what they had with you won't be replicated. It can't be, because it was born from authenticity, from effort, from two people trying, even if imperfectly, to build something real. And while they were busy underestimating you, you were evolving. They didn't notice the strength it took for you to love them with your whole heart. They missed the emotional maturity behind your patience. And they certainly didn't see the courage it took for you to finally walk away. But absence has a way of clarifying what presence obscured. And when the avoidant finally understands you were never replaceable, it's not just a realization, it's a reckoning. They said you were too much, too emotional, too intense, that you cared too quickly, loved too deeply, and asked for too much. But what they failed to see is that what they called too much was exactly what real love requires. You weren't asking for attention every hour of the day. You weren't demanding impossible gestures. You were asking for presence, for clarity, for consistency. You were asking for the basic things that make someone feel safe and seen. But to an avoidant, even the basics can feel like pressure. And instead of recognizing your emotional investment for what it was, love with substance, they labeled it as a burden. You were not clingy. You were invested. That distinction matters more than people realize. Clinginess comes from fear, from insecurity. It tries to possess, to control, to hold on too tightly out of desperation. But investment is different. Investment is intentional. It's measured. It means you saw something in them worth growing, and you were willing to show up even when it wasn't easy. You were willing to be vulnerable, to communicate your needs, to be emotionally available. That takes strength, that takes maturity, and it takes courage. Because showing up fully means risking disappointment, especially with someone who has a pattern of pulling away when things get real. The avoidant couldn't tell the difference because to them, love feels like a trap. It brings up old wounds, unresolved fears, and past dynamics they've never fully dealt with. So instead of facing those things, they retreat. They create emotional distance. They send mixed signals. They become cold when things start to warm up. And they rationalize it by saying you're too intense, too demanding, when in reality, all you ever did was try to bring depth to a connection that was begging for it. But here's the thing. You didn't fall in love with their avoidance. You fell in love with the moments in between, the glimpses of openness, the rare occasions they let their guard down, the times they made you feel like maybe, just maybe, they were capable of something more. And because of that hope, you stayed longer than you should have. You tried harder. You explained yourself over and over again, hoping they'd see that you weren't trying to control them. You were trying to connect. You weren't trying to invade their space. You were trying to build a space you could both belong in. You showed up emotionally because that's who you are. You don't do half love. You don't do lukewarm. You give what you'd want to receive. Honesty, loyalty, emotional effort. But the avoidant wasn't ready for someone who operated at that level. They wanted connection without cost, intimacy without responsibility. They liked the idea of love, but not the work it demanded. So they pulled away and made you feel like you were the problem. They made you question your standards. They made you second-guess your emotional responses. And maybe for a while, you believed them. Maybe you toned yourself down, tried to appear less needy, made yourself smaller just to maintain the connection. But none of that worked, did it? Because the real issue was never you. The issue was their inability to hold space for the kind of relationship they said they wanted. You weren't the one running from love. You were the one trying to build it, piece by piece, brick by brick, with someone who only knew how to tear down what was being built. And still, you kept offering more time, more energy, more understanding, not because you didn't have boundaries, but because you believed in the connection. You believed that if you just showed them enough care, enough consistency, they'd meet you halfway. And yet they didn't. They mistook your emotional openness for weakness. They confused your patience with passivity. But what they missed entirely is that love is not passive. It's not timid. It's not distant. Love leans in. Love stays. Love communicates. What you were offering wasn't excess. It was exactly the kind of love that makes a relationship meaningful, the kind that shows up when it's inconvenient, the kind that holds space for growth and healing, the kind that says, I'm here, even when it's hard. But to someone avoidant, that kind of love feels overwhelming. Not because it's wrong, but because it confronts them with everything they've been avoiding in themselves. It forces them to look in the mirror and ask why they keep pushing people away, why they're more comfortable with detachment than connection, why they keep labeling emotional investment as drama when really it's the most honest form of care. And one day, when the noise clears and the dust settles, they'll look back and realize that what they thought was too much was simply the presence of someone who was emotionally available, someone who wasn't afraid to love out loud, someone who didn't play games. That kind of love doesn't come around often. And when it does, most people don't know what to do with it. But you weren't wrong for loving that way. You weren't wrong for wanting clarity, depth, and connection. You weren't clingy. You were invested, and that's the very thing they didn't know how to receive. They thought they could replace you. That's the part that stings at first. Watching someone who once shared your bed, your secrets, your softest moments suddenly act like they can just slide someone else into that space. It looks effortless on the surface. A few new photos, some smiling stories, maybe even a new relationship not long after you walked away. And for a moment, you question everything. Were you really that easy to move on from? Did it matter as much to them as it did to you? Were they ever really there in the first place? But what you come to understand slowly is that what they're doing isn't replacing you. It's distracting themselves, because you weren't just a habit or a convenience. You were a real connection. You didn't just offer them your time, you offered them your truth. You showed up with your flaws and your depth and your heart wide open. That kind of presence doesn't get swapped out like a pair of shoes. It lingers, it leaves a mark, but they don't know how to sit in the discomfort of that loss, so they numb it. With new attention, with shallow connections, with the illusion of moving on. People like that don't grieve immediately. They avoid it. They avoid the feelings that come up when someone truly meaningful exits their life. Instead of processing, they perform. They put on the face of someone who's fine, who's thriving, who's better off. But inside, there's a growing awareness that something is off. Because the more they try to replicate what they had with you, the more they realize it can't be done. The inside jokes aren't there. The emotional safety isn't there. The quiet understanding you offered without needing them to explain themselves isn't there. What they're left with is surface. Pretty, maybe, but empty. And here's what makes that reality harder for them to face. You never had to chase them. You gave, you loved, you showed up, you listened. You were all in, not because you were desperate, but because you chose them, because something in them made you believe it was worth it. You didn't need to be entertained or constantly stimulated. You just needed truth, intimacy, a real connection. But they didn't know what to do with that kind of consistency. They mistook your groundedness for predictability. And now that you're gone, they can't find that anywhere else. So they search. Not because you're easily forgotten, but because your absence creates a discomfort they're not ready to face. The kind of discomfort that comes when you realize you had something real and you didn't know how to hold it. The kind that creeps in during those quiet moments when there's no one texting them goodnight, when they hear a song that reminds them of you, when they laugh and wish they could share it with someone who really got them. Those are the moments that bring you back, not just as a memory, but as a realization. They didn't lose someone ordinary. They lost someone who gave them emotional depth, care, and intention. But the avoidant doesn't always understand this right away. They operate in delay. While you were present, emotionally available, and trying to build something real, they were holding back, testing the waters, keeping one foot out of the emotional door. So they never experienced the full weight of your love until it was gone. And once they feel that void, they try to fill it, not with reflection or growth, but with activity, with dating apps, with casual flings, with anything that keeps them from sitting with the fact that what you gave them can't be copied or replaced. What they don't understand is that connection isn't just about chemistry or attraction. It's about feeling safe. It's about knowing you can be fully yourself and still be met with understanding, not judgment. You provided that without needing to be asked. You created a space where vulnerability wasn't scary, where silence wasn't awkward, where depth wasn't avoided. That's what's missing in the people they try to use as substitutes. The dynamic isn't the same because you were the one bringing that emotional richness to the table. Without you, all they have is interaction without intimacy. They may not admit it. In fact, they probably won't. Most avoidants don't come back with grand apologies. They come back subtly. They test the waters. A text here, a like there. A question that seems random but is loaded with meaning. They come back not because they suddenly became someone different, but because they start to feel what they've lost. Not just a person, but a connection that grounded them in ways they didn't realize until they were back to drifting. And even then, the realization is quiet. It's not an explosion. It's a slow unraveling, a comparison they can't stop making, a comfort they can't replicate, a presence they start to miss, not because they're lonely, but because they remember what it felt like to be seen without having to perform. That's the thing about real love. It doesn't vanish when it's no longer convenient. It leaves a residue, and that residue makes everything else feel less alive by comparison. So no, they didn't replace you. They just surrounded themselves with noise to drown out the silence you left behind. But noise doesn't satisfy. It just distracts. And eventually, even the avoidant learns that you can't outrun a connection that touched your soul. You can only ignore it for so long before it starts echoing louder than ever. Absence teaches in ways presence never could. When you were in their life, they never had to imagine what it felt like to go without you. You were there, texting back, making time, forgiving, holding the space. You were consistent even when they were inconsistent. You were emotionally present while they were emotionally guarded. You leaned in when they leaned back. And because you kept showing up, they never had to fully confront what it would mean to lose you. You became a steady presence in their world. And like most steady things, they started to take it for granted. That's human nature, especially for someone who's avoidant by design. They confuse stability with predictability. They equate emotional safety with boredom. But once the presence disappears, everything changes. The silence becomes loud. The texts that used to come in regularly are gone. The comfort of knowing you'd always be there when they needed you vanishes. And at first, they convince themselves it's fine. They convince themselves they needed space, that detachment feels better, lighter, less complicated. They might even feel a sense of relief temporarily, because avoidants often confuse emotional space with emotional peace. They equate withdrawal with clarity. But what they don't expect is the kind of silence that begins to echo. Not just the absence of messages or calls, but the absence of being understood, of being seen by someone who never asked them to be anything other than what they were. That kind of space doesn't soothe them, it exposes them. Because when someone truly leaves, not out of spite, not as a strategy, but because they've given all they could, they take their energy with them. They take their light, their care, their patience, their emotional investment. And the void that follows is not just emotional, it's spiritual. It shifts the energy in the avoidance world in a way they can't articulate at first. All they know is that something feels different, and not in a good way. The days feel flatter. The small joys aren't as joyful. There's an internal itch they can't scratch. That's what your absence does. It highlights the weight of your presence. They begin to notice it in the small, unspoken moments. When something funny happens and their first instinct is to share it with you, then they remember they can't. When they have a rough day and instinctively look for the comfort they used to find in you, only to realize it's no longer there. When something important happens and they reach for their phone out of habit, but your name isn't at the top of their conversations anymore. These aren't dramatic revelations. They're quiet, private reminders of everything they lost. The avoidant doesn't cry about it on cue. They don't write emotional essays about what you meant to them. They just sit with it. And it stings deeper because they know they had a role in creating the silence they now resent. Absence forces them to confront the emotional vacancy they always carried within themselves. It makes them realize that the comfort they found in you wasn't just about companionship, it was about relief. You were the buffer between them and their own emotional walls. You softened the hard parts. You brought light into places they didn't even know were dark. And now, without you, they're face to face with their own inability to connect deeply. They have to sit with the reality that someone once saw them, chose them, stayed with them, and they couldn't handle it. They don't say it out loud, but they replay the moments, the arguments, the moments they dismissed your feelings, the times you asked for connection and they shut down instead. They realize how often you tried to make things work, how you communicated when things were off, how you gave them chances they didn't deserve. And it starts to land in ways it never did before. Not because you finally said the right thing, not because time magically changed them, but because absence cleared out the noise long enough for the truth to settle in. Avoidants don't learn from confrontation. They learn from space. They don't absorb lessons in the middle of conflict. They absorb them when the dust settles and there's no one left to blame. That's when the mirror becomes unavoidable. And in that mirror, they don't just see you. They see their own emotional limits. They see how they pushed away the very thing they said they wanted. They see the difference between being alone and being at peace. And it's in that silence, that absence, that they finally understand what you brought to their life. There's a difference between missing someone and recognizing their value, and the avoidant, through space, begins to see both. They miss the laughter, the care, the ease. But more than that, they begin to see that what you gave wasn't common. It wasn't replaceable. Because what you gave didn't come from a place of fear or manipulation. It came from presence, from genuine emotional availability. And that becomes the loudest lesson of all. Not what you said, not what you asked for, not what you fought about, but what they feel now that your voice is gone from their life. There comes a moment when the avoidant looks around and realizes they're still running. Only now they don't know what they're running from anymore. At first, it seemed like space was the solution. The distance gave them control. They didn't have to answer uncomfortable questions or sit in the vulnerability that comes with real intimacy. They didn't have to look you in the eyes and explain why their actions never matched their words. Avoidants protect themselves with silence. They use detachment as armor. But what no one tells them is that silence eventually becomes a prison. Detachment isn't peace. It's just a slow erosion of connection. And after enough time, they start to feel the cost. When you left, they may have felt a brief sense of relief. No more pressure. No more conversations about feelings. No more having to confront what they were avoiding in themselves. But relief doesn't last when it's built on avoidance. Eventually, the high of distance fades, and they start to feel the hollowness that sits beneath it. And in that hollowness, they begin to realize that everything they thought they were escaping wasn't about you. It was about them. The discomfort they ran from wasn't your love. It was their own inability to let love in. You didn't overwhelm them. Their own fear did. They begin to feel the weight of emotional responsibility. Not because you're still asking for anything, but because now there's nothing distracting them from the truth. You were the one doing the emotional labor. You were the one checking in, making sure the relationship had direction, reminding them what it meant to be in something real. You weren't perfect, but you were trying. You were aware. You were present. And now that you're gone, they start to notice just how much of that emotional structure was built on your effort. The weight of the relationship was never equal, and they never saw it until they had to carry the silence alone. And that silence does something to them. It starts to point out their patterns. They begin to notice how they keep cycling through the same dynamic, pulling away just when things start to feel close, sabotaging the very thing they say they want, choosing short-term safety over long-term depth. And as much as they'd like to blame the people they've dated, they can't deny the common denominator anymore. It's them. It always was. They begin to see that connection requires risk, that love asks you to show up even when it's messy, even when it triggers old wounds. And they remember how you showed up, how you stayed when things were unclear, how you asked the hard questions and didn't run from the answers. That memory doesn't leave. It lingers. Because what they thought was ordinary was actually rare. You didn't just love them, you tried to understand them. You were patient with their silence. You didn't demand perfection, you just wanted truth. You didn't ask for them to change overnight. You just wanted them to meet you where you were, but they couldn't. And now they have to live with that. They have to sit with the realization that they pushed away the one person who actually wanted to know them, not the version they performed, but the real them. And in the stillness, they start to see the difference between being alone and being isolated. When they had you, being alone felt like a choice. It was a break, a breather, a moment of space before returning to something steady. But now that you're gone, being alone feels different. It feels like something's missing, not just a person, but a connection, a softness, a mirror, someone who made